I lived with the Cortlands for a long time. Seven, I mean, the writing the novel from the time I began it to the time I sent it off to my agent was probably 7 years or so. And then there were several more years of trying to find the right house for it. We found the right house. And then there was another year of editing. And then there was another, because of the way things were at that time, it was another year and a half of just waiting for the book to come out. So it was a long time, in which time I didn't start something new. I never started something new. That was my story. And that, and that was my, uh, the one story I had at the time, and I was sort of waiting to see what would happen with it when the book came out. So in the meantime, I wrote the current, but at the end of Descent, um, there's a line where Sean, the boy, is following his father and the family, or what's left of the family. I'll leave that vague, driving back to Wisconsin, and Sean is following in the truck behind the station wagon, and he's following them. And there's two words that are, he's following them for now. And that is all added. I think many readers would not think much about that. But for me, that for now meant a lot to me. And it was the idea that Sean is so changed, this family is so changed that there's no really going back to Wisconsin and picking up, where they left off. And in the novel Descent, he's already been driving around on his own, doing his own things, trying to cope with his own, sense of purpose and also his role in his sister's missing, her sister's abduction. So I kind of imagined him all this time while I was, away from the Cortlands. He's just been driving around doing his thing, doing his carpentry thing. And that kind of stuck in my mind. And I mentioned that I didn't resolve everything in the current. And one of the things that is unresolved at the end is what happens to one of the main characters, whose name is Danny Young. At the end of the current, they find his truck, and there's a bullet hole in it, but there's no blood and there's no sign of foul play otherwise, and he's just missing. And his truck is near the Mississippi River on the border between Minnesota and Wisconsin. And it looks like he just got out and started walking across a bridge or something. And that's kind of just how that, it's not the main story in the current. The other main story is more or less, resolved. But his whereabouts are unknown. And a lot of people wanted to know what happened to him. Readers let me know that they want to know what happened. And some of them probably might have thought I was planning a sequel, and I wouldn't blame them, but I wasn't. I was never planning a sequel. When I was casting around for my new novel idea, it was put into, I got into my mind this idea of the crossing paths of a character from each of those previous two novels. And you may be familiar with this advice from Stephen King. I think it's Stephen King who says, if you have a great idea for a story or a novel, don't write it down in your notebook, because notebooks are the places where bad ideas go to be immortalized. But do your best to forget about it. And if you can't forget about it, if it just keeps bothering you or whatever, then start writing it. And that's I took that to heart, I think, a long time ago. And that is not to say that I thought that this crossing paths idea was a great idea, but I couldn't get it out of my mind. I couldn't think of something else. So ultimately, I just started writing it to see what would happen, to see where it would go. And that meant bringing back Sean from Descent, Sean Cortland, who is sort of naturally on his way to Wisconsin, which is his hometown, his birthplace. He's going to see, vaguely, he's thinking about stopping and seeing his father, maybe his mother. They're not together. And his truck randomly breaks down just across the Mississippi in a town in Wisconsin. It happens to be on the other side of the bridge where we last saw Danny Young's truck. And the time frame is a matter of a week or two between when Danny Young's truck is found and Sean's truck breaks down on the other side. So this puts them both, I thought, pretty logically. It didn't feel forced that they would both be in that same place at the same time. And then they do meet, and that's why I consider it not a series, because you don't have to read those previous two novels to read this new one, but a kind of trilogy in the sense that, let's say, the Border trilogy, Cormac McCarthy's Border trilogy is a trilogy. Each of the books stand alone, but there's a character, and maybe this was part of the inspiration. There's a character from each of the first two books, two young men actually, who in the third book, totally unexplained, but it makes sense because they're both in the same kind of ranch world in the same part of the country in Texas. They're now friends working at a spread. So I wanted to have the meeting actually happen between my two characters and show the moment where they actually accidentally cross each other's path. And from there, a series of events, like, a chain of events happens that leads inevitably to the drama and the well, I don't want to give anything away, but the culmination of the story. As I mentioned before, I don't plot things out, and I tend to take it, scene by scene. And a lot of the characters who became memorable in this novel, Distant Sons, began as just props, really. They were needed for a scene for some reason. Like Viegas, the detective, Sean quickly, as this is his habit, he quickly gets into trouble in town, and we first see him again after his truck is broken down. We see him again. The next we see him, he's in an interview in a police station because he's been involved in a fight. And I just needed a detective, someone to interview him, and so I came up with this idea of Detective Viegas. And she does interview him, and we learn a lot about what's happened to him in the last couple of weeks that he's been in town through this interview. And at the end, she has no recourse. No one's pressing charges. He hasn't really done anything wrong except being part of a bloody fight, which a waitress named Denise Givens got punched in the face, and by him accidentally. And so in the end, she releases him, and he goes out, and he's standing sort of meditatively outside the police station. The wind is blowing. It's cold. It's near the end of March, or middle March or something. There's still snow on the streets, and someone walks out of the police station behind him, and it's Detective Viegas. Now she's out of that environment, and this was not sort of planned or scheduled. But she comes out, and they begin talking, and he's smoking because he's always smoking. And she asks for a cigarette. She gives him one, and she just sort of takes a sip, and that's all she wants of it. But anyway, so now it's more than just an interview. Now they're interacting outside of that theater of law enforcement. And again, but from there, I didn't know what role she would play, only that now she's sort of more involved than she was before. And this is kind of how this happens with these sort of bit characters, these bit players. They become gradually more important. And this was the case with the other one you mentioned was Henry Givens, Denise Givens' father, who becomes to me, very interesting, lively character, and eventually ends up involved in one of the major sort of plot turns in the book, and is there at the very end of the book. But when I first saw him, he was just a prop sitting in a wheelchair when Sean walks into the house. And that's kind of the joy of writing for me is you need a character, a little, bit player for whatever reason, and this player ends up becoming important and significant.